Before we dive into today's mystery, hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications. It helps us keep uncovering the unknown. Now, let's begin. On a bitterly cold night in December 2024, Sam Nordquist's phone went silent. His closest friends noticed first. Text messages unread, calls ignored, social media untouched. At first, they thought he might just be taking a break. But as hours turned into days and days into weeks, a sinking realization gripped those who knew him best. Sam Nordquist was missing. What no one knew at the time was that Sam was trapped in a nightmare so horrific, so inhumane, that it would later be compared to some of the most disturbing crimes in recent history. This is a chilling, heartbreaking, and ultimately eye-opening story of how a young man vanished into the hands of monsters, and the brutal truth that the world discovered too late. Sam Nordquist was, by all accounts, someone who had fought his way through life. As a transgender man, he had spent years navigating a world that wasn't always accepting. Despite the challenges, he had recently begun embracing his identity with newfound confidence. His life wasn't perfect. Few people's are, but he had friends who loved him, a community that supported him, and dreams of finally finding stability. In the months leading up to his disappearance, Sam had been couch surfing, staying with different people in upstate New York. He had moved into a house with acquaintances, people he believed were trustworthy, but there were whispers about that place. It wasn't just a home, it was a trap. Something was deeply, dangerously wrong. The house was a rundown property in Yates County, New York. From the outside, it looked like any other neglected home. A sagging porch, windows covered with dark curtains, the kind of place you wouldn't glance at twice. But for those who lived inside, it was something else entirely. Behind those doors, there were rules. Strange ones, unspoken ones, the kind that shifted depending on the mood of the people in charge. Sam was new, and at first, they let him believe he belonged. But soon, the rules changed for him. The house had swallowed others before, and it was about to consume him too. It started with control. They took his phone, claiming it was for his own good. They dictated what he could eat, when he could sleep, who he could talk to. And then the real horror began. When Sam first went missing, no one immediately suspected the house. After all, he had moved around frequently, and there was always a possibility that he had left on his own. But then came the messages, disturbing, cryptic text messages that fell off. Friends who had once chatted with Sam every day started receiving strange replies. The words didn't sound like him. The phrasing was wrong. And worst of all, the messages were infrequent, often taking hours or days to appear, as if someone else was controlling them. Sam's best friend, Ava, was the first to suspect foul play. "Sam, where are you?" she texted. The reply came hours later. "I'm okay. Just busy. Talk later." That wasn't like Sam. He never cut conversations short. And talk later was never something he said. It was as if someone else was pretending to be him. Ava wasn't the only one who noticed. Others tried calling, only get short, robotic responses. And then, one day, there was nothing at all. No texts, no calls, just silence. By mid-January 2025, Sam's disappearance had become impossible to ignore. His friends contacted the police, but at first, there wasn't much they could do. Sam was an adult. There was no immediate evidence of foul play. The authorities assumed he had left voluntarily. But Ava and others refused to accept that. They started digging, asking around, tracing his last known locations. And everything pointed back to the house in Yates County. When the police finally conducted a welfare check, the people inside were calm. Too calm. They claimed Sam had been there, but left weeks ago. They had no idea where he went. They even offered to let the police search the house. It was clean, almost too clean. There was nothing that indicated Sam had been harmed there. But the officers noticed something odd. None of the house's residents seemed particularly concerned that a man who had been staying with them had simply vanished. And then the neighbor spoke up. A woman living down the street approached Ava after the police left. "I don't know what's going on in that house," she said, voice low and fearful. "But I hear things. Screaming. At night. And sometimes crying." Ava's stomach dropped. Someone in that house had been crying for help. Had it been Sam? For weeks, the case stalled. The police had no body, no hard evidence, just suspicions and a growing sense of dread. But then, in February 2025, everything changed. A hiker in a remote field, miles from the house, made a gruesome discovery. Human remains. The body was so decomposed that identification took days. But the DNA results confirmed what many had feared. It was Sam. And the details that emerged were far worse than anyone had imagined. Sam hadn't just been killed. He had been tortured for months. Beaten, starved, assaulted. His body bore signs of unimaginable cruelty. The people he had trusted had turned him into their prisoner, their victim. And when they were done, they discarded him like trash. Sam's body had been found. That was the breakthrough everyone had been waiting for. But now came the hardest part. Proving who was responsible. The police had their eyes on the Yates County house for weeks. But until Sam's remains surfaced, there was no hard evidence linking its residents to his disappearance. Now, they had more than suspicion. They had a crime scene. They had a body. They had proof of something terrible. But when detectives knocked on the door again, they were met with a performance. "Oh my God, he's dead," one of the housemates gasped, feigning shock. They wept. They held their heads in their hands. Some even clutched their chests as if grief had physically wounded them. It was a show, one they had rehearsed well. But there was one problem. Not a single one of them asked how Sam had died. It was an immediate red flag. If a person you had lived with suddenly turned up dead, wouldn't your first instinct be to ask what happened? The people inside the house weren't grieving. They were covering up. Detectives had seen it before. And now, they had a new mission: break the facade and expose the monsters underneath. For weeks, everyone inside the house had stuck to their story. Sam left on his own. No one had seen him since. But one of them was about to crack. Her name was Lauren Mitchell. She wasn't innocent. Far from it. But she wasn't like the others. She hadn't been the ringleader. She hadn't been the one who decided Sam's fate. She had been a follower, a coward too afraid to leave, too afraid to speak up. And now she was terrified. When detectives pulled her in for questioning, she was jittery, biting her nails, her eyes darting toward the door as if expecting someone to storm in and silence her. But the pressure was too much. "I can't do this," she muttered under her breath. "Can't do what?" The detective leaned in, voice calm but firm. She hesitated. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said for words that shattered the case open, "I know what happened. Lauren spilled everything." According to her, Sam had never left the house willingly. He had been trapped, held against his will, beaten for sport. The ringleader, a man named Kyle Mathers, had turned Sam into his personal victim. Kyle was the kind of person who thrived on control. He liked to see people suffer. And for some reason, whether it was Sam's identity, his vulnerability, or just the sick pleasure of power, Kyle had chosen him as his prey. He liked to break people, Lauren confessed, eyes welling up. It was a game to him. Sam had endured weeks of horror, starvation, beatings, forced isolation. He wasn't even allowed to sleep properly. Every time he tried to rest, Kyle would wake him up with a cruel slap or a bucket of cold water. But the worst part? Kyle wasn't alone. Several others in the house joined in, either out of fear or enjoyment. Some laughed as Sam begged for food. Others watched as he was beaten, too afraid to step in. And a few, like Lauren, helped, even if guilt now gnawed at their souls. But Lauren had limits. And when Kyle suggested getting rid of Sam permanently, she knew it had gone too far. "We have to stop," she had pleaded. Kyle had only grinned. "No, he's not done suffering yet." One freezing night in mid-January, it happened. The breaking point. Sam was already weak. His body was covered in bruises, his ribs visible through his skin. He had tried to escape once, but Kyle and the others caught him, dragging him back inside. That night, the punishment was worse than usual. Kyle and his followers beat him mercilessly, laughing as he tried to crawl away. They forced him to stand, only to shove him back down. And then, in a moment of pure sadism, Kyle grabbed an iron rod heated over the stove and pressed it against Sam's back. The house filled with the sound of screaming. It was the last time Sam's voice was ever heard. By the next morning, he was gone. Not just unconscious. Not just barely clinging to life. He was dead. And suddenly, Kyle wasn't laughing anymore. He had gone too far. Even he knew it. The group panicked. For the first time, they weren't the ones in control. Sam's body was wrapped in a tarp, loaded into a stolen truck, and driven miles away before being dumped in a field. They thought the cold would preserve him. They thought no one would find him. They were wrong. Lauren's confession was all police needed. Within 24 hours, the house was raided. Kyle and his followers were dragged out in handcuffs, their faces pale as they realized the game was over. The evidence was overwhelming. Bloodstains in the basement, messages between Kyle and his followers mocking Sam's suffering. A hidden burner phone used to send those robotic texts to Sam's friends, trying to make it seem like he was still alive. Kyle didn't say a word during the arrest. No cocky remarks. No sinister smirks. He knew what was coming. At the trial, prosecutors didn't hold back. They painted a picture of unimaginable cruelty, a modern-day house of horrors hidden in plain sight. They described the way Sam had suffered, how his captors had treated his pain as entertainment. The jury was visibly shaken. When the verdict was read, the courtroom was silent. Kyle Mathers, life in prison without the possibility of parole. His accomplices, sentences ranging from 20 years to life, depending on their involvement. Lauren Mitchell, the one who finally spoke up, received a plea deal. She would serve 15 years in prison. Some called it too light. Others believed it was necessary. But one thing was clear. She would never forget what she had done. Sam's friends and family sat in the courtroom, tears streaming down their faces. Justice had been served, but the pain of losing him would never fully fade. Lauren Mitchell sat alone in her prison cell, staring at the cracked wall in front of her. Every night, she woke up to the same nightmare. Sam's voice, screaming in agony, begging for help. She had been there. She had seen it all, and she had done nothing until it was too late. At first, she had convinced herself that she wasn't like Kyle or the others, that she had simply been too scared to act. But prison had a way of making you face the truth. And the truth was that she had been complicit in a crime so horrific that the media compared it to cases like Gabriel Fernandez and Sylvia Likens. Stories of prolonged torture, of evil disguised as everyday life. And the worst part? No matter how many years she spent behind bars, it would never be enough to erase what she had done. The trial wasn't just about punishing Kyle Mathers and his accomplices. It was about exposing the why. The prosecution painted Kyle as a sadist, a predator who thrived on the pain of others. He had chosen Sam because he saw him as an easy target, someone without strong family ties, someone different, someone vulnerable. They describe, in horrifying detail, how Sam was starved, beaten, and tortured over weeks. How he was forced to stand in a corner for hours without food or water. How Kyle would pretend to be his friend one moment, only to turn on him the next, as if his suffering was a form of amusement. The evidence was overwhelming. Blood stains hidden beneath layers of fresh paint. The burner phone used to send fake messages to Sam's friends, creating the illusion that he was still alive. The disturbing text messages between Kyle and his followers, laughing about their game. The defense tried to argue that Kyle had suffered childhood abuse himself, that he had been raised in violence and knew no other way. But the jury wasn't convinced. Some wounds turned people into survivors. Others turned them into monsters. And Kyle was a monster. The most gut-wrenching moment of the trial came when Sam's best friend, Ava, took the stand. Her hands trembled as she pulled out her phone, scrolling to the last text message she had received from Sam. "I'm okay. Just busy. Talk later." Her voice cracked as she read aloud. That wasn't him. That was them. And I should have known. Tears streamed down her face. He was begging for help in ways I didn't understand. And I didn't push hard enough. I didn't call the police sooner. I didn't. She broke down, unable to finish. The courtroom was silent. Even the judge looked shaken. Because this wasn't just about punishing the guilty. It was about the weight of regret, the pain of realizing that sometimes the signs are there, but we refuse to see them. Kyle Mathers showed no emotion when he was sentenced to life without parole. No remorse. No anger, just a blank stare, as if he had already accepted his fate long before the trial even began. His accomplices reacted differently. Some sobbed, begging for leniency. Others remained stone-faced, refusing to acknowledge the weight of what they had done. Laura Mitchell, the one who had finally confessed, sat motionless as the judge handed down her 15-year sentence. She had made a deal, but there would be no escaping the prison inside her own mind. For friends and activists who had fought for Sam, the sentences brought some relief, but no real closure, because true justice would have been saving him before it was too late. Sam Nordquist's death was more than a tragedy. It was a warning. His case forced people to confront hard truths about the world we live in. Monsters don't always hide in the shadows. Sometimes they live in plain sight. Silence can be deadly. Ignoring the warning signs, dismissing your gut feeling, choosing comfort over confrontation. It all has consequences. Vulnerable people are often preyed upon, and society must do more to protect them. In the years following the trial, activists fought to strengthen laws protecting marginalized communities, especially transgender individuals. Sam's friends started a foundation in his name, dedicated to supporting at-risk youth, helping those who felt abandoned, just as Sam once had, and his story became a rallying cry. Whenever someone ignored the warning signs of an abusive situation, people whispered his name. Whenever a vulnerable person was gaslighted into believing they were safe when they weren't, people told his story, because some stories aren't just meant to be told. They're meant to save lives. If you ever notice something that feels off, a friend sending strange texts, a neighbor whispering about screams at night, a person who seems trapped in a dangerous situation, don't look away. Speak up. Ask questions. Push harder. Because the difference between silence and action, it's the difference between life and death. And Sam Nordquist deserved to live,